A major hurdle for Microsoft's Activision acquisition has just been crossed. For more than a year now, we've been waiting as Microsoft has been trying to make progress to close its Activision acquisition. They have gone through a lot of different things. They've had to go through the US courts, the UK courts, the EU courts, and everything else and everything in between. And today, according to Reuters, it looks like Microsoft is going to get approval from the EU. Now, it's worth pointing out before we dive into the post that Reuters has been on the leading edge of kind of breaking news of what's going on in the EU when it comes to the specifics of this case against Microsoft and Activision, primarily with Sony bringing up the complaint. So let's dive into the news here. So according to three people, that is Reuters saying, according to three people, Microsoft will in fact win approval of their Activision acquisition in the EU. This is a massive hurdle for Microsoft that will be behind them. Of course, this is still, according to insiders, has not been published yet. We'll likely have to wait until April 25th. But the big key to this is that the EU sources, according to Reuters, are saying Microsoft will not have to spin out Call of Duty or World of Warcraft or any other titles to get this through. Now, they'll more than likely have to agree to some terms, meaning the contracts that Microsoft is trying to sign with Sony, for that matter, for 10 years, much like they've done with NVIDIA and GeForce and Nintendo for 10 years. That is all likely to be part of this deal to get the approval signed off. But this is massive for Microsoft. There were two markets that Microsoft primarily cared about, the EU and the US. And with the EU now behind him, and typically we would have expected more issues out of the EU potentially than the US, but we will wait and see. This is big relief for Microsoft. This is more than halfway done for what they need to get this signed off. This is such a big deal that I suspect that Microsoft is celebrating this news significantly because they've put a ton of effort to try to close this deal. And so, yeah, this is the news that Microsoft has been waiting for, but that's not all of the good news coming out for the Microsoft camp. Now, the next big hurdle Microsoft obviously has will be in the US, and they have court dates coming up later this year that potentially might delay the closing a little bit unless they come to a deal ahead of that. But the next big thing for Microsoft is getting the US approval. Now, Microsoft, I can't imagine them trying to strong arm and push their way through the US, but they might try to do that now that they have pretty much the regulatory approval abroad outside the US that they're looking for. But inside the US, Foss Patents did some digging around, and there's some really interesting stuff. Now, Microsoft for a long time has been trying to get documents specifically from Sony. It's called discovery. It's part of a legal process that would help bolster their case against effectively saying that this is anti-competitive for the consumer and the likes of that. And so Foss Patent was able to dig up some information where Microsoft has been trying to understand like the exclusivity agreements Sony has and how they're positioning and how they're using it. And Sony up until now has been saying, nope, we're not giving you those. And then now they're going to have to. Foss Patents, which I'll drop a link down in the description, points out, he says, Sony's request to limit custodians, aka people whose documents must be produced, is denied with respect to a Sony in-house antitrust counsel. Sony had somewhat hilariously argued that searching a Japanese executive files would be unduly burdensome because the documents aren't Japanese, and the judge was not hearing any of that. This same judge also mentions that according to Sony, Microsoft would have been willing to drop one of those custodians. So whatever this deal that Microsoft was trying to get, Microsoft was saying, look, we'll drop a custodian, but you have to give us the documents. Microsoft was apparently willing to drop one, but Sony's like, no, we're not going to do that. But in the absence of such agreement, the judge has decided that to part against Sony. It's possible that because Sony went this route and is not willing to cooperate, they're actually going to have to produce more documents than if they would have just said, yeah, we'll actually, give those out for the court and for part of discovery. If you're wondering why Sony has to produce any documents at all, Sony can't just leverage a complaint against Microsoft and then saying, no, we're not actually going to let you see what we're doing because that's anti-competitive for not for the courts necessarily, but you have to have the full story, and you can't have just Sony saying, look, Microsoft is going to put us out of business and lock us out and not be willing to produce how Sony actually is its standing in the market. According to this complaint, Sony's request to stop this document discovery pretty much has been squashed. Now, there is one area where Sony did come away with a meaningful win from this, but it's not too significant. Microsoft initially, I believe, wanted exclusivity agreements and content going back to roughly like 2013, but according to the judge, they only have to go back to January 1st, 2019, as opposed to 10 years. However, this period should be pretty sufficient for Microsoft and its crack legal team effectively to isolate the fact that Sony has a lot of exclusivity agreements and they're doing just fine in the market, and Call of Duty is not their primary means of survival. They have other titles, they have their own exclusive content coming out, and there you go. So in the world of Microsoft, this has been a very favorable week for them, at least in the EU courts, and it's looking favorable potentially here in the US courts. Now, granted, the US has a pretty hands-on approach right now. I would say pretty heavy-handed approach trying to stop acquisitions given the current makeup of the FTC. But that being said, it does look like Microsoft has a better than good chance now potentially to close this deal, considering that the EU is signed off. The fun and interesting thing is going to be what happens if the EU signs off and in the US they get approval as well. What happens in the UK? The UK might be in some trouble now because of their standing in the world, leaving the EU, which I'm not going to get into the politics of that. It feels like their heavy-handed approach could be very limited by the fact that the US might just say, okay, well, we're just going to sell in the EU and the US, and people can maybe switch their regions to download the game. Granted, Microsoft wants to sell in the UK. Don't get me wrong. That is a large market. There's a lot of people there that buy Call of Duty, play Warzone, buy those microtransactions. They don't want to ignore that economy. But that being said, I don't think Microsoft would back away from the deal because the US said yes, the EU said yes, and the UK was like, no, you got to sell and spin out Call of Duty for this to happen. So that will be the fun thing to watch. So the next big sort of milestones that we're going to be relating to, as noted in the Reuters post, will be in April. April 25th is a long way from now. One thing I will expect to see is somebody like Bloomberg or other publications to pull their own sources and say, look, we also are hearing that this deal is likely to be approved. Once you get multiple sources saying the same things, then it's more so probably the formality of what the EU has to write up. Remember, they got to produce reports. It's a bureaucratic government agency. There's going to be a lot of documentation and PDFs and prints and everything else. And so they got to get all their ducks in the row. They've got to come out with the formal issues that Microsoft has to agree to, namely those terms with the third-party entities. And then the things will proceed. Everybody signs off, and the Activision deal would be approved in the EU, and then all eyes effectively turn to the US. It'll be interesting to see if Microsoft is able to get this thing closed in the US before that. I'm not sure then. I believe off the top of my head, I thought the date was in August of when they were expected to go to court and make their argument. That doesn't mean things can't be resolved outside the courts. Now, the other question becomes, if Sony is looking at this and saying like, crap, we're not going to get what we want in the EU, what should we go ahead and sign that deal with Microsoft? Remember, Microsoft, even Brad Smith was walking around showing it off. He's like, I've got the 10-year contract right here. If Sony feels that they are truly potentially in a vulnerable state, maybe they take the deal and then this thing whole gets washed over and the FTC is like, okay, no, there are no more formal complaints. We'll do our review, and then maybe that expedites that process a little bit. But we will see. Sony finds itself in a precarious position because what would actually happen? What if the EU's agreement doesn't say you have to sign a 10-year deal with Sony? We agree. They have a dominant position. They don't have to have Call of Duty. Microsoft it'd be quite funny if Microsoft is able to get this deal closed without signing any contracts with Sony, and then Sony would be left out at that point. I don't think that's realistically going to happen. I think Sony would sign the papers well before that, but either way, this has been an interesting and hot off the press development of what is happening with the EU and Microsoft's massive acquisition. If you want to stay updated on everything else that's happening in the world of Microsoft, Xbox, and beyond, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.